Hi, so the advocacy organization that I was looking into, NORD, the National Organization for Rare Diseases. So today they are having a conference, which I will be attending virtually. The tickets were a little too expensive to go in person in DC. I'm a little bit late, but the agenda today, the most applicable to political advocacy, are in the afternoon. How to participate in rare disease research and political breakthroughs hope now and on the horizon. So we're going to join this breakout session, how to participate in rare disease research. I have this invite here, hopefully they let us in.
It was really daunting figuring out what does this diagnosis actually mean for my patient and their family. You know, there's so many disorders now we just don't know a lot about them, and there's a need for more research on those disorders. And so that's what kind of prompted me to get involved in this. It's become a significant portion of my time.
And there's a lot of steps here, but with just everything that we've been talking about, it kind of shows you where the basic research comes into play, right? That first purple box, it's you're building your preclinical toolbox, building all the tools that you're going to need to move things and treatments into the pipeline, and learning about those disease mechanisms. And then once you get past that, you have your translational research. You're working with people and institutions to build those therapies, to figure out which ones are going to work, and then it leads to what we call these proof of concept studies. And these studies are so vital, because these are the studies that show the FDA that whatever treatment you're testing works in your disease. Even if it's just in a cell or a mouse, that is evidence that shows this could work in you. And that's so important. And so, anything that happens before we get to the clinical trial pipeline, we call all that just preclinical research, right? So you hear all these things and you're like, what does it all mean? It's all that work that needs to be done before you get to the clinical trial pipeline.
I was going to say, I'd like to point out, every rare disease is at a different stage of its sort of maturity as an understood entity. So there's some rare disorders where they've only been described for about a year or two. And so those are going to be primarily involved in the preclinical toolbox phase. There's other more mature disorders, like we heard about SMA this morning, that's actually really further along in the pipeline, but there's still clinical research that still needs to be done for sort of long-term. They grow up stem cells from that and keep them in a freezer. And they collect blood samples or buccal or cheek swabs, something where they can grow up sort of your DNA or your cells and keep them available for doing further experiments with. And there's various different avenues for participating in biobanks. Some of them are sort of centralized for different disorders. Some of them are disease specific.
So that session was pretty informative. Something that struck me is just the measure of involvement that these patients that have these rare diseases have in the research process. And then it reminded me of Pretty Crystal, the lawyer who's advocating for patent reform, how she suggests democratizing the patent system, because these patients, they'll put so much into the research. They're giving their health data, their genetics to the research of these diseases, and then they don't own the product of that. And of course it does benefit them, but they should have some say as far as how this information can be trademarked as or patented as intellectual property. I think that's a big deal. And obviously the researchers are, you can tell that they're passionate about the impact that they're making and the quality of life improvements that they can bring to the patients that they're studying and the treatments that they're working on. But I just think that we need more patient involvement and community involvement in how this intellectual property is protected, because we want to encourage this innovation. And we saw the graph there of all the steps before a clinical trial. And if we can invest more into that for these rare diseases through nonprofits and NGOs and through government organizations, then I think that's an important step to maintaining a friendly environment to innovation while keeping things affordable. And I'm curious to see on the next session, which is about hope on the horizon with policy initiatives and research. I'm hoping to see what kind of policy and research and how those intersect. A lot of the sponsors here, I'll show you, are Big Pharma, which is good. I mean, they're showing their support for rare diseases, and I just hope that that we can find a solution that allows them to be profitable if they're for-profit companies, because that's how our current financial system works, or that they can be financially sound if they're nonprofit, while keeping things affordable for patients. And I think if we can also remove barriers to participating in clinical trials and maybe even giving them a share of the intellectual property for their contributions, so that they aren't the guinea pigs and then also the patients as a consumer having to pay out the nose for these drugs and going into a lot of medical debt. So I think that all of these things intersect, and I'm excited for the next session.
or making some protein. But sometimes you can't make a protein that will actually fix the problem. Gene therapies for small numbers of people are currently not really commercially profitable, and it's costing so much to make each dose of gene therapy that it's prohibitively expensive sometimes for it to be studied. So we're working with a variety of both academic, industrial, and government partners to try to see if we can advance manufacturing, in part to try to get it towards something that would be automated, which may make a big difference. That's manufacturing. But then there are things that we can do in the regulatory world, is that we reuse part of the therapy over and over again for a certain type of, for any given type of specific gene therapy. And we haven't made use of that, the ability to reuse the vector backbone. That's the thing that counted over the past years, is we treat each one of these as a new entity when it comes into the FDA. But now with this platform therapies provision that we have, we'll hopefully be able to leverage the manufacturing, toxicology, a lot of information that goes in for one product for other products. And that will hopefully reduce the cost of development, decrease the time, and ultimately draw more people into this. The two other things I'll just finish up by telling you about here as part of the suite is that it's not gone unnoticed that rare diseases are not just here in the United States, right? They're global. When you think about the commercial viability of a product, we might not have enough people to make something commercially viable in the United States, but if you collect people globally, you might actually have a commercially viable product, which is to have essentially harmonization of some of the requirements so that there can be simultaneous submission of packages across the globe, or near simultaneous, which should help, again, increase interest of manufacturers getting into the space. And finally, we're going to try to leverage something we learned from Operation Warp Speed. Operation Warp Speed was something that helped make medical products during the pandemic. That their greatest challenge often is getting timely quality advice from FDA. So we will be running in the coming months, starting to run a pilot program to see if having kind of warp speed communication with FDA around promising very rare disease products. We're going to be looking first to help the development of products for diseases for which there is no alternative and for which there's significant morbidity or early mortality. And so we'll see if that works, then we might expand that much further. So in rare disease therapy development, the traditional model of trying to have randomized trials, right, it doesn't work. I mean, it works in larger populations, but we're trying to deal with diseases, conditions that may affect 10, 20 people. And so the concept of how you get data to get something over the finish line to have an approved product has to be considered carefully. And in carefully considering that, we realize that we're increasingly going to have to use our accelerated approval authorities. Accelerated approval is when we give something, it's still an approved product, but instead of approving it based on a clinical endpoint of how someone feels, functions, or survives, we use a scientific endpoint of either a biomarker or an intermediate assessment.
So I think with this we see this balance between safety and approval acceleration. So obviously knowing the risk of a certain procedure or therapy, particularly pharmaceuticals, it's important. Patients need to know that it's going to be effective and that it's going to be safe relative to its benefit. But when patients are facing morbidity, like when they have a terminal condition and and a certain treatment could potentially extend their life, that's where the COVID response was mentioned in this, as far as in some circumstances that can be appropriate. And then how that relates to innovation and affordability. We want to see these therapies be developed in a way that is safe, effective, and affordable. And so I like that they had an FDA speaker here to kind of address that, how the regulatory process influences the affordability. And we also in class have spoken about orphan drugs and how sometimes or common disease drugs are repurposed as orphan drugs, which could be helpful, but it also prevents the FDA from approving another treatment for the specific orphan disease or rare disease, which I think could be a barrier. But the point of this was to show how we can advocate, right? So I'm going to show some of the things on this webinar. So how you can take action. So you can volunteer, And a big part of this is awareness. And a big highlight was that in order for these diseases to be researched and to be believed as commercially viable, we need the awareness. And so I think forums like these, organizations like NORD, are powerful because they bring patients together in a way that they could advocate. And I really like how that could combine with ideas of patent reform, of more community involvement in patents. I think that could be a powerful force. And then you can join the Rare Action Network and advocate for federal and state policy initiatives that improve rare health.